Hey everyone, tonight we're going to dive into one of the most enduring mysteries on Earth. Out on the windswept Salisbury Plain in southern England stands a circle of ancient stones that has puzzled humanity for centuries. Stonehenge. You've seen it in pictures, maybe even visited in person. But the truth is, even after all the research, all the excavation, all the speculation, it remains one of the most enigmatic monuments ever built. And the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes. From a distance, Stonehenge can almost look ordinary, just a ring of stones in a field. But the closer you get, the more extraordinary it feels. Massive blocks of sarsen stone rise upright, some capped by horizontal lintels locked together with joints more suited to carpentry than to boulders. Around them are smaller bluestones, weathered by time but still arranged in purposeful patterns. Together they form a circle, but also a puzzle that refuses to be solved. Before we walk any further into this circle of secrets, I'd love to hear what you think. What is it about Stonehenge that fascinates you most? The mystery of how it was built, or the question of why it was built at all? Share your thoughts below, and let's see how many different angles this mystery can open up. The official story says that Stonehenge was built in stages between 3,000 and 1,500 years before Christ. That means it was already ancient by the time the pyramids of Egypt were rising. Think about that for a moment. When Julius Caesar's legions marched into Britain, Stonehenge was already a ruin thousands of years old. Whatever meaning it once held was already fading into myth. Even the Druids, those robed priests often imagined among its stones, came along much later. By their time, the circle was a relic from a forgotten age. But here's the first thing worth considering. Even with our modern technology, moving stones that weigh 25 to 40 tons is no small feat. Building cranes, diesel trucks, reinforced roads, those are the tools we would use today. And yet, whoever raised Stonehenge did it without wheels, without iron, and without written plans. Somehow, they quarried stones, dragged them across miles of landscape, shaped them with remarkable precision, and stood them upright in a formation that still stirs the imagination thousands of years later. There are no written records, no tablets, no scrolls, no inscriptions left to explain what they were doing. All we have are the stones themselves and the ground beneath them, which has given up only fragments of clues, bones, charcoal, post holes, bits of pottery. Enough to piece together a rough chronology, but never enough to truly understand the why. And that's where the mystery deepens. Because if you ask archaeologists for an explanation, they'll give you possibilities. A temple, a calendar, a place of burial, a site of ritual. But ask them for certainty, and you'll find hesitation. The truth is, nobody really knows, and that uncertainty leaves space for speculation, for folklore, and for questions that go far beyond what we usually accept about human history. When you stand at Stonehenge, or even when you imagine standing there, you can feel that sense of layered time. The earthworks that surround the stones are even older than the stones themselves, suggesting the place had meaning long before the great trilithons were ever raised. What was it that made this patch of plain so sacred? Was it the contours of the land, the rising of the sun, or something else we've forgotten? There's also the question of design. The stones are not random. They're arranged in circles and horseshoes, aligned with the solstices, and connected to other features of the landscape. This was not the work of amateurs. Whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing, and yet we're told they were simple farmers, living in a world without writing or complex tools. How did they manage to accomplish something that continues to baffle us? Legends have always rushed in where evidence runs thin. Medieval stories claim the wizard Merlin brought the stones from Ireland with the help of giants. Folklore spoke of healing powers, of stones that sang, of energy that pulsed through the ground. For centuries, poets and scholars have imagined Stonehenge as a temple of forgotten gods, a place where the dead communed with the living, or even a remnant of some lost civilization. None of it fits neatly with the cautious language of archaeology, but all of it speaks to the same feeling, that there is more here than meets the eye. And maybe that's why Stonehenge still captures us. It's not just the stones themselves, it's the silence around them, the unanswered questions, the sense that a chapter of human history has been torn out of the book, leaving us to guess at the missing words. We know people built it. We know they laboured for generations, but why? Why pour so much effort into something so mysterious? Why create a monument whose meaning seems to slip further away the more we study it? It's interesting to consider how Stonehenge has been framed over the centuries. In the Enlightenment, scholars dismissed it as the work of primitive tribes, too superstitious to do more than pile rocks in a circle. Later, in the Romantic era, it became a symbol of mystery and ancient wisdom. In the 20th century, archaeologists began to uncover its true age and complexity, and suddenly it was clear that whoever built it was far from primitive. They were sophisticated in ways we still struggle to understand, and today, in an age of satellites and lasers, we continue to scan and map the site, only to find that every answer raises more questions. Maybe that's the real secret of Stonehenge. It resists being solved. It keeps us looking, keeps us wondering, keeps us aware that history is deeper and stranger than we often imagine, and in that sense, it stands not just as a monument to the past, but as a mirror for us in the present. We see what we want to see in it. The ingenuity of ancient engineers, the magic of myth, the resonance of forgotten traditions, but the stones themselves remain silent. So tonight, as we begin this journey through Stonehenge's mysteries, let's hold on to that silence. Let's walk slowly, as if through a fog where shapes loom and vanish, where every step reveals something new, but never the whole picture. We'll talk about the stones themselves, about the impossible task of moving them, about the wider landscape of circles and mounds, about the alignment with the stars, the burials and the bones, the myths of giants and magicians, and the theories of lost knowledge. And finally, we'll ask the hardest question of all: why does the official story leave so much unexplained? What is it they don't want us to know? Stonehenge still stands, not just as a ruin in a field, but as a circle of secrets. And as we begin, remember, sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't the ones we solve, but the ones that keep us wondering. If the stones of Stonehenge seem mysterious when they stand in a circle, they're even more mysterious when we ask how they got there in the first place. Because for all their weathered beauty, these are not just local rocks scattered across a field. They were chosen, shaped, and transported with purpose. And the distances they travelled, and the sheer weight they carried, continue to leave us wondering how it was possible at all. The largest blocks are the sarsen stones. Each one weighs up to 40 tons. To put that in perspective, that's about the same as 6 or 7 African elephants. Imagine trying to budge even one of them without cranes, engines, or modern roads. Yet the builders managed to drag dozens of these giants from the Marlborough Downs, a ridge of chalk and sandstone lying some 20 miles north of the plain. 20 miles might not sound like much, but picture hauling that weight across rough land without the benefit of wheels, and you start to understand the scale of the problem. The smaller stones, though still enormous by human standard, are the so-called blue stones. These carry a mystery all their own. Geological studies show they came not from anywhere nearby, but from the Preseli Hills of Western Wales. That's about 150 miles away. Even today, that's a drive of several hours. In the Neolithic world, it meant a journey across rivers, hills, and open land. Some experiments suggest they could have been dragged on sledges, floated on rafts, or even rolled on logs. But whenever modern researchers try to replicate those feats, they often run into the same difficulty. It's possible in theory, but in practice it demands far more manpower and precision than we tend to imagine Neolithic farmers had at their disposal. How did they do it? Archaeologists have tried staging experiments, harnessing volunteers to ropes and sledges. Some stones have been moved short distances, but usually with difficulty, often ending in broken equipment or exhausted participants. It works for a single stone perhaps, but to do it again and again over 100 times, and to coordinate it over miles of landscape, that suggests organisation and skill on a level far beyond the simple life we usually associate with the early agrarian communities. And here's another layer worth thinking about. The blue stones aren't just unusual because of their distance. They also seem to have been brought in stages. Some evidence suggests they were set up in circles in Wales before being dismantled and moved eastward to Salisbury Plain. Imagine that. A sacred monument uprooted from one landscape and replanted in another, stone by stone. Why go to such trouble, unless those rocks held meaning that transcended their weight? Were they revered as symbols, as talismans, as carriers of some unseen power? It's fascinating to consider that the builders didn't take the easier path. If the goal was simply to raise a stone circle, they could have used local rock. Sarsens are scattered across the chalk downs of southern England. Yet they went to extraordinary lengths to bring stones from far away, carrying with them a connection to another place, another story. That choice alone tells us something profound. Stonehenge wasn't just about building with what was available. It was about building with intent, about embedding meaning into the very fabric of the monument. Legends remembered this strangeness, even if the details blurred over time. In one medieval tale, the wizard Merlin orchestrates the transport of the stones from a sacred circle in Ireland. Giants help him carry them, leaping across the sea with their burden. To a modern mind, that sounds like fantasy. But maybe what's important is not the literal image of giants, but the recognition that moving the stones was beyond ordinary human means. To a medieval storyteller, the only explanation was magic. Even earlier traditions speak of the stones as if they had a life of their own. Folklore claims they could move at night, or that they sang when struck, or that they held healing power. To us, those are myths. But they also suggest that people long remembered the stones as something extraordinary, something that could not be reduced to simple explanations of how. Archaeologists sometimes argue that the stones were moved using vast numbers of people, hundreds, maybe thousands, pulling together. And it's true, humans are capable of remarkable feats when united in purpose. We've raised cathedrals, dug canals, and carved monuments with little more than sweat and determination. But it still begs the question, what drove such effort? What compelled entire communities to dedicate themselves, not just for a season but for generations, to hauling stone mountains across the land? Think about it. This was not a weekend project. Building Stonehenge unfolded over centuries. Different phases, different generations, different layers of meaning. Each group of builders inherited the work of the last and carried it forward. That's something we often overlook in our modern sense of time. We expect projects to be finished quickly. But Stonehenge was the opposite. A long unfolding, a vision carried through lifetimes. It wasn't just about the stones themselves. It was about the act of building, the continuity of purpose, the link between past, present, and future. Still, we're left with the stubborn question of method. No wheels, no draft animals strong enough to haul 40 tons, just ropes, wood, and human muscle, or so we're told. And here's where some researchers, and more than a few alternative thinkers, raise a provocative possibility. What if the builders had techniques we've forgotten? Methods of transport, methods of lifting, methods of leverage that have simply vanished from our records? Not advanced machines, perhaps, but clever uses of balance, friction, or resonance that would look like magic to us today. There's even been speculation, fringe to be sure but intriguing, about the use of sound. Could vibration or resonance have played a role in moving the stones, the way sound waves can shift sand or water? It's an idea often dismissed as fantasy, but it lingers because the conventional explanations feel just as unsatisfying. In the end, we're left with an uncomfortable truth. We don't really know how they did it. If the idea of forgotten techniques sounds speculative, it's worth remembering that human ingenuity often leaves traces only in stories. Entire bodies of knowledge can vanish when tools rot, when oral traditions fade, when the priorities of a new generation shift. We assume that because we don't see written manuals, there was nothing to learn. But that may not be true. What if the Neolithic world held practical skills about ropework, timber, or balance, that were never recorded, yet were every bit as effective as our machines today? Even in recent history, we see examples of knowledge slipping away. Polynesian navigators once crossed thousands of miles of ocean without charts, guided by the stars, waves, and the flight of birds. For centuries, Europeans dismissed that possibility, assuming primitive people could not achieve it. Only later did researchers confirm that they really had, and that the techniques still survive among a few masters today. If we could be so wrong about seafaring knowledge just a few hundred years old, imagine what might have been lost after 5,000 years. That sense of loss makes the legends surrounding Stonehenge feel less like fantasy and more like memory. Giants, wizards, singing stones. Perhaps these were ways of pointing toward techniques or powers the storytellers could no longer name. folklore often preserves echoes of truths we can't quite grasp anymore. And if you look at Stonehenge through that lens, the impossible task of moving mountains begins to look less like a mystery and more like a forgotten chapter of human possibility. Of course, mainstream archaeology reminds us to keep our feet on the ground. Experiments with ropes, sledges, and grease-smeared tracks have shown it's at least plausible to drag multi-ton stones across land. By setting logs as rollers or sliding sledges along lubricated tracks, teams of people can shift incredible weights. With enough effort and a well-coordinated crew, it could be done. But even here, there's a catch. Every successful experiment works for one stone, under controlled conditions. Scaling that up to the dozens of stones, across the miles of real terrain, remains far more daunting. It's like proving that you can push a car 100 feet, and then being asked to push an entire fleet across a country. And then there's the matter of setting the stones upright. Imagine standing before a 40-ton block, taller than a house, and needing to tip it into a deep pit without it snapping in two. Engineers suggest it could be done with an earthen ramp, ropes and counterweights. Again, possible in theory, but it requires a delicate balance of force and timing. One mistake, and the stone cracks. Yet at Stonehenge, the builders didn't just raise them. They placed horizontal lintels across the top, fitted with mortise and tenon joints carved into solid rock. That's carpentry thinking applied to megaliths. It suggests not only strength, but precision. The Sarsens themselves have a story written into their surfaces. Some show signs of having been carefully shaped, their edges smoothed and squared. That alone would have taken immense effort with stone tools, rubbing and hammering until the blocks matched the builder's vision. Others were left more natural, perhaps to preserve a sense of raw power. Together, the choices hint at a blend of practicality and symbolism. The monument wasn't just engineered, it was composed, like a piece of music. What makes the feat even more astonishing is that it wasn't unique. Across Britain and Europe we find dolmens, passage graves and standing stones that also required moving heavy blocks across landscapes. The builders of Stonehenge were part of a broader tradition, a world where hauling stone was somehow woven into the spiritual fabric of life. Perhaps the act of moving itself was sacred, a pilgrimage of labour, binding communities together in the service of something larger than themselves. In that light, the impossible task becomes not just an engineering problem, but a ritual, a collective expression of devotion. Still, there's a lingering unease. Because while other sites involved heavy stones, Stonehenge took the practice to another level. The distances were greater, the weights heavier, the precision more exacting. And it raises the question, why here? Why this plain? Why this particular circle of stones? Why not build closer to the quarries, where the material was plentiful? The decision to bring stones from so far away feels almost defiant, as if the builders wanted to prove that distance and weight were no obstacles. Or perhaps, more simply, that only these stones from these places would do. Modern researchers sometimes speak of social capital, the ability of leaders to mobilize communities through shared belief. Maybe the leaders of the Neolithic world inspired others to follow, convincing them that hauling stones across 150 miles was worth the hardship. But even if that's true, it still leaves us with the physical puzzle. Belief can motivate, but it doesn't make stones lighter. It doesn't solve the logistics of rivers, hills and valleys. The mystery remains stubbornly in place. It's interesting to pause here and think about how our modern minds interpret such feats. We assume that if something looks impossible to us, then it must have been impossible for them too. But that may be a limitation of our imagination. We picture the past as a dimmer version of the present, forgetting that ancient people had different priorities, different strengths, different ways of working with nature. Where we might see only brute force, they may have seen opportunity. The flow of water, the rhythm of muscle, the leverage of wood. Maybe they discovered methods that to us seem too simple to notice, but to them were powerful enough to move mountains. In the end, the transport of the stones sits in a strange place between myth and mechanics. On one hand, we can sketch out scenarios of ropes, sledges and ramps. On the other, we can't quite replicate the full scope of what was achieved. Somewhere in that gap lies the mystery. It's a reminder that Stonehenge isn't just a circle of stones. It's a story of movement, of determination, of choices that carried meanings we can no longer see. And perhaps that's the real marvel, not just that the stones stand where they do, but that they got there at all. As we leave this act behind, one image lingers, a procession of people, straining at ropes, sliding sledges over mud, guiding rafts down a river, inching giants of stone toward a distant plain. The effort would echo for generations, binding communities together in shared purpose. And when at last the stones rose into place, they stood not only as a monument, but as a memory of movement, of struggle, of something so important that it demanded the labour of lifetimes. And that brings us to another layer of the story, because Stonehenge was never alone. Across the surrounding landscape, hidden under fields and buried in soil, lies an entire world of circles, mounds and pathways. If the stones themselves are impressive, the larger network they belong to is even more astonishing. And it raises another question. Was Stonehenge just one piece of a far bigger design? When most people think of Stonehenge, they imagine a solitary ring of stones standing against the sky. But the truth is, Stonehenge was never alone. It was part of a vast ceremonial landscape, a network of monuments spread across the Salisbury plain, connected by alignments, pathways and traditions that stretched back thousands of years. To focus only on the stone circle is to miss the larger picture, the context that makes it even stranger. Because once you see Stonehenge as one piece of a larger puzzle, the questions grow deeper still. Scattered around the plain are earthworks that predate the stones by centuries. Long barrows, earthen mounds raised over communal graves dot the horizon. The cursus, a vast linear earthwork stretching for nearly 2 miles, runs east to west across the landscape. Nobody is sure what purpose it served. It's too large to be a simple path, too deliberate to be an accident. Then there are Woodhenge and Durrington walls, circular timber and earth monuments that suggest a rhythm of life and death, ceremony and gathering, all playing out long before the stones we know as Stonehenge were ever raised. What's remarkable is how these sites interconnect. Recent archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have revealed shafts, ditches and buried structures that tie the monuments together. They suggest a design not limited to one generation or one monument, but a living landscape shaped over millennia. It's as if the plain itself was transformed into a kind of sacred canvas, marked and remarked with each new phase of belief. Take Durrington Walls, for example. Just a couple of miles from Stonehenge, it was once a massive circular enclosure, surrounded by banks and ditches. Excavations show it was a thriving settlement, with houses, hearths, and pottery. It may have been home to the very people who built Stonehenge. Some scholars think Durrington was the world of the living, a place of feasts and gatherings, while Stonehenge represented the world of the dead, a place of ancestors and ritual. If that's true, then the River Avon that flows between them may have served as a symbolic bridge. The journey from life to death, from village to monument, enacted in processions across the land. This idea of paired worlds, of wooden monuments for the living and stone monuments for the dead, adds another layer to the story. It suggests that Stonehenge was not isolated ritual architecture, but part of a larger cosmology, a worldview expressed in earth and timber and stone. The landscape itself became a story, one that communities could walk, inhabit, and perform. And here's where it gets even more intriguing. Beneath the soil, radar scans have uncovered an array of hidden features around Stonehenge. Pits arranged in circles, avenues stretching across the plain, traces of structures long since buried. Some of these are enormous, like the recently identified circle of shafts near Durrington, each one 10 metres across and 5 metres deep, forming a boundary around the site. These discoveries suggest that what we see today, the iconic ring of standing stones, is just the tip of the iceberg. The true Stonehenge was never a single monument. It was an entire ritual complex sprawling across miles layered over centuries. If we step back even further, we realise this pattern isn't unique to Salisbury Plain. Across Britain, circles of stone and wood rise from the earth. Avebury, with its vast outer ring enclosing a village. Castlerig, nestled among the hills of Cumbria. The ring of Brodgar in the Orkneys, standing against the northern winds. Each has its own character, its own alignment, its own story. But together they speak of a culture, or perhaps many overlapping cultures, for whom circles were not just shapes, but sacred designs. Avebury in particular rivals Stonehenge in scale. Its outer ditch and bank enclose the largest stone circle in Britain, with avenues of stones leading away like arms. Walking through it, you feel dwarfed not just by the stones, but by the sheer sense of space. Unlike Stonehenge, which feels contained and focused, Avebury feels expansive, embracing. Some have called it a landscape temple, where the act of moving through the avenues was itself part of the ritual. What's striking is that many of these sites seem older than Stonehenge, or at least contemporaneous with its earliest phases. The idea of gathering stones, raising posts, digging ditches, it was already established long before the iconic trilithons were lifted into place. That raises a provocative question. Did Stonehenge inherit a sacred tradition from cultures even older? Was it the culmination of a long lineage of ceremonial building, or was it something entirely new, imposed on an already sacred land? Archaeological evidence suggests that before the stones there were posts. At Stonehenge itself, traces of wooden post holes date back thousands of years earlier than the stone phases. Imagine that. A circle of timbers, long since rotted away, standing where the stones would later rise. To the people of that time, the site was already marked, already meaningful. Stonehenge as we know it may have been a late chapter in a story that began with wood and earth. It's fascinating to think about the symbolism of that transition. Wood is impermanent, tied to the cycle of growth and decay. Stone is enduring, outlasting generations. To move from wood to stone could reflect a shift in worldview. From temporary markers to eternal monuments, from living memory to ancestral permanence. Perhaps the builders wanted to fix their cosmology in a form that would last forever, or at least as close to forever as human hands could achieve. The layering of monuments also hints at continuity across vast spans of time. We often imagine prehistoric cultures as fragmented, each generation living in isolation. But the landscape of Salisbury Plains suggests otherwise. Here was a tradition strong enough to persist for centuries, even millennia passed down through memory and ritual. What must it have felt like to live in such a world, where the very ground was etched with the history of your ancestors, where every mound and ditch told a story of who you were and where you came from? And yet, even as we uncover these layers, we're left with more questions than answers. Why circles? Why alignments? Why invest so much in monuments that serve no obvious practical purpose? These weren't fortresses, nor were they houses. They were built for meaning, a meaning we can only glimpse at the edges. The more sites we uncover, the clearer it becomes that Stonehenge wasn't an isolated mystery. It was part of a broader tradition of shaping the landscape into sacred form, but what that form meant to the people who built it remains elusive. As we peel back the soil of Salisbury Plain, another theme begins to emerge: continuity across vast distances. The circle at Stonehenge doesn't just echo nearby monuments like Woodhenge or Avebury. It resonates with circles scattered across the whole of Europe and beyond. From Brittany's Carnac alignments to the Great Passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, from Orkney's Neolithic villages to the standing stones of Callanish in Scotland, we find the same impulse: to mark time, space, and meaning with earth and stone. This is where Stonehenge starts to feel less like an isolated achievement, and more like a node in a much larger network of sacred landscapes. Each site has its own quirks, but together they reveal a cultural horizon that valued alignment, rhythm, and repetition. It's as if the circle was not simply a shape, but a worldview. The technology that helps us see this now, radar, lidar, magnetometry, has stripped away the idea of Stonehenge as an island. When researchers scanned the ground around it, they revealed hidden ditches, shafts, and avenues stretching out like the spokes of a wheel. Some align to other monuments, some trace paths to rivers, some point towards solstice horizons. These are not random. They're intentional lines, linking what at first looked separate into a coherent whole. The sense of scale is staggering. The so-called Stonehenge landscape covers miles, encompassing burial mounds, cursus monuments, timber circles, and enclosures. Imagine standing in that world thousands of years ago. The plain would not have been empty. It would have been alive with markers, with pathways, with monuments rising and decaying across generations. Stonehenge was only the centerpiece, the crown jewel in a setting that turned the land itself into a ritual theatre. One discovery that highlights this is the Avenue, a processional route connecting Stonehenge to the River Avon. Its alignment with the midsummer sunrise suggests it wasn't simply a road, but a ceremonial journey, guiding processions from water to stone, from the fluid world of life to the enduring world of ancestors. Paired with the evidence of feasting and gathering at Durrington walls, a picture forms of entire communities moving through this landscape, celebrating cycles of life and death. Even older than these monumental works are the traces of wooden posts and earthworks at the Stonehenge site itself. Archaeologists have uncovered pits dug thousands of years before the stones were raised, marking the place as special long before sarsen or bluestone touched the ground. This continuity across centuries is almost beyond comprehension. Imagine passing down a sacred duty, not just for a few generations, but for 1,000 years or more. That level of cultural persistence is almost unknown in our modern world. And yet, persistence is exactly what the landscape tells us. Each new monument was not a replacement for the old, but an addition, a new verse in a long song. Stone circles, long barrows, cursus earthworks. Each layer speaks of people remembering, adapting, adding their own chapter to a story already in motion. When we look at the plain today, we see scattered fragments, but in its prime, it would have been overwhelming. Imagine hundreds of people gathered at Durrington feasting on cattle, driven from distant lands, processions moving down the avenue, the sun rising over the heelstone, fires burning in circles of timber. To live in that world would have been to inhabit a landscape alive with meaning, every mound and ditch telling you where you stood in the cosmos. And yet, what makes Stonehenge unique is that it survived. Wood rots, earth erodes, but stone endures. When the timber monuments collapsed and the earthwork softened, the sarsen still stood, weathering centuries of rain and wind. That endurance may not have been an accident. It may have been the point. To fix in stone what otherwise would fade, to anchor memory in something that could outlast empires. Perhaps that's why Stonehenge, more than its neighbours, came to define the mystery. It is the survivor, the one that still commands attention long after its companions have faded from view. But to truly understand it, we have to see it not as a lone circle, but as the shining tip of a vast, submerged structure of meaning. At midsummer, when the dawnlight spills across the plain, it passes directly through Stonehenge in a way that feels more like performance than coincidence. The heel stone, standing just outside the circle, catches the rising sun, and the light streams into the monument's heart. It's a moment that still draws crowds today, a ritual of watching and waiting that must stretch back thousands of years. The stones frame the sky, and in doing so they transform the landscape into a kind of theatre where earth and heavens meet. What makes this so remarkable is that the same stage is set again in reverse, half a year later. At midwinter, the sun does not rise into the circle, but sets into it, slipping neatly between the tallest trilithons on the southwest horizon. To a farming society, this was no small detail. These alignments gave rhythm to the year, anchoring the times of planting, harvest, and preparation for the harshest season. Where we consult calendars and clocks, they look to the stones, and through the stones to the sun. The builders clearly paid close attention to these cycles. The geometry of Stonehenge isn't random. It reflects a deep familiarity with the turning of the sky. Scholars studying the layout have argued that its design encodes more than solstices. Some see evidence that the arrangement of stones allowed predictions of lunar events, even eclipses. The idea that a monument raised 5,000 years ago could anticipate such complex cycles stretches our assumptions about what prehistoric people knew. Yet the patterns are there, carved not into text or parchment, but into the alignment of stone. Think for a moment about what it means to notice the 19-year cycle of the moon. That's not something a single observer can track in a lifetime, without extraordinary discipline. It requires memory passed down across generations. It demands patience, continuity, and reverence for the slow dance of the heavens. If Stonehenge does indeed mirror such cycles, then it tells us something profound about the people who built it. That they were not only farmers, but also watchers of the sky, keepers of the knowledge preserved through time. It's worth remembering that for them, sky and ritual were not separate domains. Astronomy was not a science isolated from belief. It was woven into the fabric of meaning, To mark the solstice was to mark life and death, light and shadow, abundance and hunger. The cosmos was alive with gods and spirits, and by aligning stone with sun, people were aligning themselves with the order of the universe. Stonehenge, then, was not only a clock but a temple, a place where cosmic rhythm was made visible, tangible and communal. This blending of skywatching and ritual isn't unique to Stonehenge. Across the world we find monuments that echo the same impulse. In Ireland, Newgrange is aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. Once a year, light penetrates the passage and floods the inner chamber, illuminating spirals carved into stone. In the Egyptian desert, Nabta Playa marks solstices and stellar risings that guided pastoral life. In the Americas, Chaco Canyon and Machu Picchu contain alignments that trace the path of sun and stars. Across continents, separated by oceans, ancient people seemed compelled to marry stone and sky. What makes Stonehenge stand out is the way it holds multiple cycles at once. It's not just one alignment or one chamber, illuminated at a special moment. It's a whole framework of sightlines and geometries that appear to weave together sun, moon, and horizon. Designing such a structure required more than brute force. It required translating the arc of the heavens into geometry on the ground. Even without written formulas, the builders must have grasped the principles of angle, distance, and proportion. Some scholars suggest they were working with the same kinds of geometric insights later formalized by the Greeks. Whether or not that's literally true, the stones themselves demonstrate a practical mathematics encoded in their placement. It's fascinating to think that the very shape of Stonehenge reflects this geometry. The circle is more than symbolic, it's the natural form for tracking cycles. A circle repeats itself endlessly, with no beginning and no end, mirroring the sun's return, the moon's phases, the turning of the seasons. By inscribing a circle of stone into the earth, the builders gave material form to the rhythms of time. And by adding lintels, by closing the circle with continuous rings, they heightened that sense of order and perfection. For those who gathered there, the experience must have been powerful. Imagine standing among the stones at dawn, waiting in cold silence as the horizon brightens. Suddenly, the sun appears exactly where the monument has foretold, flooding the space with light. In that instant, the universe would feel knowable, dependable, even friendly. The stones had spoken true, and the people had aligned themselves with cosmic order. It wasn't just astronomy, it was reassurance, a ritual of certainty in a world of uncertainty. That reassurance may have been as important as the alignments themselves. To live in the Neolithic world was to face constant risk, of hunger, of disease, of weather beyond control. But at Stonehenge, at least once or twice a year, the community could gather to witness proof that the cosmos still turned as expected. It gave rhythm to their lives, confidence to their rituals, and perhaps hope that order could be maintained even in times of hardship. In this sense, Stonehenge is both practical and poetic. It is a calendar, yes, but also a place of awe. The alignments were not hidden details, known only to a few. They were spectacles designed to be seen, felt, and remembered. The stones brought the sky down to earth, made the heavens something you could walk among. And in doing so, they turned the plane itself into an observatory. Not an observatory of lenses and instruments, but of standing stones, shadow, and light. If the solstices are the most visible alignments, the subtler rhythms of the moon may be the most impressive. Some scholars believe that certain sightlines at Stonehenge track the moon's extreme positions on the horizon, a cycle that takes 19 years to complete. To mark such a cycle is no small task. It would mean noticing where the moon rises and sets, then carrying that knowledge across generations until the full pattern became clear. In a world without writing, memory itself was the instrument, and monuments like Stonehenge became the pages on which memory was inscribed. The idea that people 5,000 years ago could anticipate eclipses has sparked debate. Some researchers point to arrangements of stones and pits that might have functioned as counting devices, allowing prediction of when sun and moon would cross paths. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, the fact remains. The monument holds a complexity that suggests its builders were not stumbling blindly through superstition. They were calculating, observing, refining, building in the stone what they had learned from the sky. It's important to recognize that this knowledge wasn't abstract. it was lived. The cycles of sun and moon were tied to survival, to planting, to the migrations of animals, to the rhythms of the body and spirit. By capturing those cycles in architecture, the builders created a shared anchor. It meant that rituals could be synchronized, feasts could be timed, and communities could gather in harmony with the heavens. In that sense, astronomy at Stonehenge was less about prediction and more about participation, joining human life to cosmic rhythm. Across cultures, this same impulse appears again and again. At Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest, light markings carved into rock chambers trace the solstices and equinoxes. At Machu Picchu, windows frame the rising sun on key dates. The Great Pyramids of Egypt are oriented with extraordinary precision to the cardinal points. These sites remind us that ancient people everywhere looked upward, saw patterns, and inscribed them on the earth. What unites them is not a single tradition, but a shared human need. To find meaning in the sky, and to anchor that meaning in stone. The builders of Stonehenge, like those of Newgrange or Chaco, were not content with passive observation. They transformed what they saw into architecture. And architecture, unlike memory alone, endures. Once the stones were raised, the knowledge they encoded became permanent. Anyone standing there, generation after generation, could watch the sun rise where the stones predicted, the moon wander where the alignments guided. It was a library without words, a classroom without chalk, a temple without sermons, knowledge embodied in place. To imagine Stonehenge as an observatory is not to strip it of mystery, but to deepen it. Because for all the talk of alignments and cycles, we mustn't forget the human experience. These weren't cold calculations, they were awe-filled encounters. Imagine the hush of a crowd waiting for dawn, the sudden blaze of light, the collective gasp as shadow and stone locked into place. For them, these were not abstract demonstrations of geometry. They were revelations, moments when heaven itself seemed to touch the earth. And perhaps that is why Stonehenge endured when so many other timber monuments rotted away. It was not just that stone lasted longer, it was that stone carried the weight of meaning more completely. Wood could mark a moment, stone could carry it through eternity. By fixing cycles of time in rock, the builders gave permanence to something fleeting, and in doing so, they gave their descendants a way to participate in a cosmos that would outlast them all. The modern mind often draws a line between science and spirituality, between astronomy and religion. But at Stonehenge, that line did not exist. Watching the sky was an act of devotion. Building with geometry was a way of honouring the gods. Ritual and observation, belief and calculation were all one and the same. To stand within the circle was to be part of a cosmos where nothing was random, where every shadow had meaning and every shaft of light was a message. Today, as crowds still gather for solstice dawns, we catch a faint echo of that feeling. The stones frame the horizon as they always have, and the sun still keeps its appointed course. We may understand it in terms of tilt and orbit, but the effect is no less powerful. For a moment the sky is not distant. It is here, inscribed in stone, reminding us that long before telescopes and formulas, people found their own ways of joining Earth to heaven. Stonehenge is many things: a feat of engineering, a place of ritual, a monument to ancestors. But as an astronomical temple, it shows us something timeless: the human desire to find order in the heavens, to weave cycles of light and darkness into the fabric of life. The stones do not explain themselves, but they continue to perform, year after year, aligning earth and sky in a drama older than history. And that performance may be the closest we'll ever come to hearing the voices of the builders, still speaking through shadow, light and stone. When archaeologists first dug into the soil around Stonehenge, they weren't just unearthing broken pottery or discarded tools. They began to uncover human remains, bones burned by fire, fragments buried in pits, traces of lives and deaths woven into the monument itself. For all its alignments with the sun and moon, Stonehenge was also a place of flesh and blood. The stones may have pointed to the heavens, but the ground beneath them tells a story of mortality, memory, and perhaps even healing. Excavations have revealed cremated remains dating back to the earliest phases of the site, suggesting that from the very beginning, Stonehenge was associated with death. Some of the burials were placed within the ring of the Aubrey Holes, a circle of pits surrounding the main monument. Others were deposited later, as though each new stage of construction carried forward a memory of those who came before. It wasn't just a monument to the living sky, it was also a monument to the dead. One of the most striking findings is how far people travelled to be part of that story. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones shows that individuals buried at Stonehenge came from distant parts of Britain, and in some cases perhaps from across the sea. They weren't local farmers alone, they were pilgrims drawn to the site from hundreds of miles away, bringing with them the dead, or coming themselves to be laid among the stones. This suggests that Stonehenge wasn't simply a local shrine, it was a destination, a place of significance known far beyond the chalk plain. Why would people undertake such journeys? One answer lies in the blue stones. Unlike the massive sarcens, these smaller stones, though still weighing several tons, came from the Preseli Hills in Wales. Ancient traditions suggest that these stones were believed to have healing properties. Even in medieval lore, the stones of Stonehenge were described as curative, capable of mending ailments and restoring health. If the blue stones carried such a reputation, it's possible that people came not only to honour the dead, but to seek life, to find relief, to be healed, to connect with powers believed to reside within the stone itself. The connection between stone and healing may sound strange to modern ears, but it fits into a broader pattern of belief. Across cultures, certain stones and minerals were seen as sacred, infused with power. Springs, wells, and groves were thought to cure or protect. To the builders of Stonehenge, the act of dragging blue stones across 150 miles may have been more than a feat of engineering. It may have been the act of transplanting sacred power, bringing the healing hills of Wales into the heart of England, fixing their energy into a circle where the living and the dead could gather. Excavations at nearby sites give us glimpses of how this might have played out. At Durrington Walls, evidence of feasting on a massive scale suggests that communities gathered in great numbers, slaughtering cattle, sharing food, and celebrating life even as they prepared to honour the dead. The bones of animals reveal they were driven from distant regions, just as the human pilgrims were. It seems that Stonehenge was part of a larger pilgrimage circuit, a place where life and death, health and memory were all intertwined. The cremations add another layer of meaning. Fire consumes, but it also transforms. By burning bodies before placing them in the soil, the builders may have believed they were releasing the spirit while anchoring the remains in sacred ground. Stonehenge thus became not only a temple of the sky, but a cemetery of the honoured dead, a place where ashes mingled with earth and where each burial tied a new thread into the tapestry of meaning. What's haunting is the silence of those individuals. We can reconstruct their diets, trace the regions they came from, analyse the tools they used, but their voices are gone. All we have are bones, burned and broken, laid in pits that speak of rituals we can only guess at, and yet in their absence they give Stonehenge its weight. The stones may stand tall, but it is the bodies beneath them that root the monument in the human condition. Consider for a moment the possibility that Stonehenge was both a hospital and a graveyard, a place where the sick came in hope of healing, and where the dead came to rest when healing was no longer possible. The blue stones may have been touched, walked among, prayed to. Pilgrims may have brought offerings, asked for cures, sought renewal. And when death came, the same stones became guardians of the departed. In that sense, Stonehenge was a threshold, a liminal space where life and death touched. Even the positioning of cremations around the outer circle suggests an act of framing. The dead were not hidden away, but placed as participants in the ritual architecture. They became part of the circle, part of the community still gathering within. Death was not exclusion. It was inclusion, an ongoing presence. And that changes how we think about the site. It wasn't just for the living or the dead. It was for both, binding generations together through ritual continuity. As more remains were uncovered, archaeologists began to see Stonehenge not as an empty monument, but as one filled with human stories. Behind each bone fragment lies a life lived, a journey made, a family left behind. The stones mark not only celestial cycles but personal ones. Birth, sickness, death, the universal rhythms of humanity, framed within the eternal rhythms of sun and moon. And perhaps that is the heart of its mystery. Because while the stones align with the cosmos, The burials root the monument in the intimate realities of human life. The sky may have given it grandeur, but the bones gave it meaning. Together they turned Stonehenge into something more than architecture. They turned it into a bridge between earth and sky, between sickness and health, between the living and the dead. Among the most intriguing discoveries are signs of injury and illness in the people who came to Stonehenge. Some skeletons show evidence of chronic conditions, diseases of the joints and spine, or injuries that may never have healed properly. These are not the bones of warriors alone, but of ordinary people who lived with pain, who may have travelled across great distances in search of relief. Their presence at Stonehenge suggests that it wasn't just a burial ground chosen by elites. It was a place of gathering for many kinds of people, each carrying their own hopes. One skeleton, known as the Amesbury Archer, was found a few miles from Stonehenge. Buried with arrowheads, tools and ornaments, he was clearly a person of status. Analysis of his teeth showed he grew up in Central Europe, perhaps as far away as the Alps, and yet he ended his life here, near the Circle of Stones. His burial tells us that the Stonehenge landscape wasn't only a local shrine, it had international significance. People were drawn from far beyond the island, bringing their traditions, their bodies, and their stories into the orbit of this place. The fact that some of these individuals were buried with grave goods while others were not suggests a range of meanings. For some, it may have been about honouring ancestry, cementing ties to the land. For others, it may have been about claiming proximity to the stones themselves, as if closeness to Stonehenge in death brought some measure of transcendence. The Bluestones' reputation as healing agents could have made burial nearby seem like a way of partaking in their power forever. It's striking to realise how closely death and healing were entwined in this ancient worldview. Today, we separate hospitals from cemeteries, but at Stonehenge those categories blur. The same stones that promised renewal also guarded the ashes of the dead. In a way, both functions aimed at the same goal: transformation. Whether through restored health or through entry into the afterlife, Stonehenge was a place of passage, of change, of moving from one state of being to another. The act of pilgrimage reinforced this. To travel miles across the landscape, carrying bones, leading cattle, joining feasts, all of it was part of the ritual. The journey itself was healing, a way of stepping out of the ordinary and into the sacred. By the time people reached Stonehenge, they had already participated in a transformation, and the stones served as the culmination of that process. Animal remains add more detail to this picture. At Durrington Walls, analysis shows that cattle were driven from as far as Scotland, slaughtered and consumed in vast numbers. These weren't random feasts. They were deliberate gatherings timed to coincide with celestial cycles. Imagine the spectacle: fires burning, meat roasting, drums and voices rising into the night, all against the backdrop of monuments glowing in starlight. Healing wasn't just an individual act, it was communal, woven into shared meals, shared rituals, shared time. In this context, the Bluestones' reputation becomes even more compelling. Their journey from the Preseli Hills would have been a story in itself, remembered and retold by every generation that visited Stonehenge. To touch them was to touch a link across distance and time, to feel part of something larger than oneself. Even today, some visitors claim a sense of energy when standing near the stones, as though the ancient associations of healing and power have not entirely faded. And yet, for all the evidence of ritual and pilgrimage, there are also traces of violence. Some remains show cut marks, fractures, or other signs that hint at sacrifice. Whether these were offerings to the gods, executions of outsiders, or symbolic acts of transformation, we cannot say. But they remind us that Stonehenge was not a place of gentle reverence alone. It was a place where life and death were confronted directly, where blood and ash mingled with stone and soil. This combination of healing and sacrifice is unsettling, but it also fits with the dual nature of the monument. Stonehenge wasn't built to be comfortable. It was built to be powerful, to heal and to bury, to give and to take away. That balance may have been at the core of its meaning. For those who came, the risk was worth it, because the stones offered a chance to step into the sacred, to engage with forces greater than themselves. Over time, as centuries passed, the burials became part of the monument's identity. Each cremation, each deposit of ashes, deepened its role as a place of ancestors. People who came later would have walked among the remains of earlier generations, aware that they were treading on holy ground. The monument's authority grew not just from the size of its stones, but from the weight of its history, built bone by bone, fire by fire. And so, when we look at Stonehenge today, we don't just see a circle of stone standing in the wind. We see a place where thousands of lives intersected, where people came in hope of healing, where bodies were burned and buried, where feasts turned night into day, and where communities wove their stories into the land. The stones are mute, but the ground beneath them is not. It speaks in fragments of bone and ash, in the traces of journeys made and rituals performed. Stonehenge was never just a monument to the sky. It was a monument to humanity itself, to our struggle with sickness, our grief for the dead, our longing for renewal. It held within its circle the entire arc of life: birth, suffering, healing, death, and remembrance. The bluestones may have been carried for their power, the sarcens raised for their endurance, but together they became a sanctuary where human experience was etched into the very fabric of the earth. For centuries after Stonehenge had already begun to crumble, when its original builders were long forgotten, the monument lived on in story. Medieval chroniclers, poets, and folk-tellers tried to explain what they saw rising from the plain, and because the real origins were lost, myth rushed in to fill the gap. To the people of the Middle Ages, the idea that farmers with ropes and sledges had raised those stones was unthinkable. Something greater had to be responsible, and so they spoke of wizards, giants, and forces beyond ordinary human reach. The most famous of these legends involves Merlin, the enigmatic wizard of Arthurian lore. In one 12th century account, Merlin is said to have transported the stones from a sacred circle in Ireland, flying them through the air with a spell or guiding them across the sea with supernatural aid. Giants helped him, according to some versions, carrying the massive blocks as though they were no heavier than bundles of wood. The story reads like fantasy, but beneath it lies a recognition. Moving such stones seemed so impossible that only magic could account for it. Other traditions spoke of giants building the monument in a single night, raising the stones before dawn broke across the sky. The speed and ease in these tales are the mirror image of the difficulty we imagine today. Where archaeology sees centuries of labour, myth sees effortless power. Perhaps that's the point. Myths don't just explain the unexplained, they invert it, turning impossibility into a story of being stronger and wiser than ourselves. Folklore gathered closer to the ground tells of the stones themselves being alive. Some stories claim they could walk, shifting positions when no one was watching. Others describe them as singing, producing tones when struck, as though they carried voices within. A few tales even speak of people healed by touching the stones, echoing the association between blue stones and curing power. These myths blur the line between monument and organism, treating Stonehenge not as inert architecture, but as a being with presence and will. What's fascinating is how often myth preserves hints of reality. Take the idea of singing stones. Modern research has shown that some of the sarsen blocks at Stonehenge do resonate when struck, producing clear, ringing tones. Geologists have tested stones from the Preseli Hills and found similar acoustic properties. To an ancient listener, those vibrations may indeed have sounded like voices, giving rise to tales of songs and whispers in stone. The myths of giants also carry a strange echo of truth. Not literal beings of enormous size, but the sense that the builders must have been larger than life, capable of feats beyond the reach of ordinary people. In that sense, the legend honours the builders with the only language available: exaggeration, reverence, awe. Giants are not real, but the work required to move those stones was truly gigantic. In modern times, fringe theories have taken up where medieval legends left off. Some suggest the builders harnessed sound in more deliberate ways, using vibration to move or levitate the stones. Others imagine forgotten machines, anti-gravity devices, or lost technologies that allowed the impossible. Archaeologists generally dismiss such ideas, pointing instead to ropes, sledges, and teamwork. Yet the persistence of alternative theories tells us something important. People continue to feel that the conventional explanation doesn't quite match the scale of the achievement. Sound, in particular, has remained a curious thread. Experiments have shown that Stonehenge's circular form creates unique acoustic effects, amplifying voices and drumming in ways that would have transformed ceremonies inside. Standing within, you would not only see the alignment of stones and sky, you would hear the space come alive, the air itself vibrating with ritual sound. For those gathered there, the experience would have been immersive, a sensory union of light, stone, and resonance. It's easy to see how later traditions of singing stones grew from that. The persistence of myth also reminds us that Stonehenge has always been more than just a set of rocks. Even after its purpose was forgotten, it demanded explanation, invited storytelling, refused to sit quietly in the landscape. Monuments of pure utility fade when their function disappears, but Stonehenge lived on because it seemed to hold something more, a mystery that begged for voices to fill it. Some historians argue that these myths shouldn't be dismissed as nonsense. They may encode fragments of memory, carried across centuries in distorted form. Oral tradition can be surprisingly resilient. Perhaps the tales of healing reflect an echo of the Bluestone's reputation. Perhaps the idea of magical transport reflects dimly remembered feats of engineering that to later eyes looked supernatural. In that sense, myth is less about invention than about survival of meaning long after direct knowledge was gone. It's worth pausing on the idea of lost knowledge. Archaeology is cautious with such claims, preferring to reconstruct methods step by step. But history shows us that knowledge can vanish. Techniques known to one generation can disappear with the next if they are no longer practiced. Entire crafts have been lost to time, their secrets buried with the last masters who held them. Why should the Neolithic be any different? The builders of Stonehenge may have had skills, traditions, and understandings that simply left no trace. To us, that feels like mystery. To them, it may have been ordinary. The myths then become a kind of bridge. They exaggerate, they transform, but they also preserve. They tell us that the stones mattered, that they were powerful, that they could not be explained away as mere rocks. And in doing so, they keep alive the sense of wonder that the builders themselves must have felt. Giants and wizards may not be real, but the awe they embody is. One of the most enduring questions raised by myth is whether Stonehenge reflects a level of knowledge that we no longer possess. Medieval tales frame that knowledge as sorcery, while modern theories sometimes frame it as lost technology. Both point to the same unease, the sense that our explanations, though plausible, don't fully capture the achievement. Think of the way myths portray movement. Stones fly through the air at Merlin's command, or stride across the land on their own. These are fantastic images, but they highlight something essential. The problem of transport has always been at the heart of Stonehenge's mystery. Inverting difficulty into magic was one way to keep the feat imaginable, and in a sense, even today we're still doing something similar when we speculate about anti-gravity or sound levitation. We reach for explanations that stretch beyond the ordinary, because the ordinary feels inadequate. But perhaps the real lost knowledge lies not in technology, but in worldview. Ancient people did not see the same boundaries we do between myth and science, ritual and measurement. To them, moving a stone was not simply an engineering task, it was a sacred act. The landscape itself was alive, the stones imbued with meaning, the heavens watching. In that context, the power to build Stonehenge did not need to come from machines or spells. It came from a shared conviction that the act itself was cosmically significant. That kind of unity, that willingness to devote generations to a vision, may be the knowledge we have lost. Still, the myths linger because they resonate with deeper truths. The idea of singing stones connects to real acoustic properties. The idea of healing stones connects to traditions of pilgrimage and medicine. The idea of giants reflects the monumental scale of the achievement. Myths may not be literal, but they often capture the emotional reality of what they describe. To stand before Stonehenge is to feel that scale, that resonance, that sense of power. No wonder the stories spoke of magic. It's also striking how myths travel. Stories about giant builders appear not only in Britain, but in many parts of Europe. Folklore across cultures often credits ancient monuments to beings larger or wiser than humans. Trolls in Scandinavia, Titans in Greece, Jinn in the Middle East. Perhaps this is a universal human reflex. When we inherit structures beyond our understanding, we attribute them to others, to powers beyond ourselves. In that sense, Stonehenge is part of a global language of myth. one that tries to reconcile the scale of the past with the limits of the present. Modern visitors sometimes echo these older myths in new forms. They speak of energy fields, of unseen vibrations, of sensations when touching the stones. Dowsers claim to detect lines of force running through the monument, part of a larger web of ley lines across the landscape. Scientists usually dismiss such claims, but their persistence shows how strongly people still feel that the stones carry more than physical weight. Whether through folklore or fringe theory, the idea that Stonehenge holds hidden power refuses to die, and perhaps that too is a kind of knowledge. Not a technical manual, but a recognition that monuments matter not only for what they are, but for what they inspire. To say that Stonehenge sings, heals, or glows with energy is to say that it touches something in us we can't quite put into words. Myths, in this sense, are less about explaining the past than about preserving wonder. They ensure that the stones never become ordinary. What we often forget is that our own interpretations may one day look like myths too. We speak of ropes and sledges, levers and ramps, alignments and cycles. Future generations might look back and see these as stories we told to make sense of something vast. Stories that say as much about us as they do about the stones. In that light, myth and archaeology are not opposites. They are parallel ways of grappling with mystery, each shaped by the culture that produces them. Stonehenge has survived because it lives in both realms. It is a place of measurements and alignments, but also a place of giants and wizards. It is calculated geometry and whispered legend, science and story woven together. That duality is not a flaw. It is the essence of its power. Myths give it soul, while archaeology gives it form. Together they ensure it remains alive in imagination, not just in stone. So when we listen to the tales of Merlin, of giants, of stones that walk and sing, we don't have to choose between believing and dismissing. We can hear them as echoes of awe, echoes of forgotten skills, echoes of the deep human need to frame the impossible in story. They remind us that knowledge can be lost, but meaning endures. And meaning is often carried not in facts, but in myths. Stonehenge, then, is not diminished by its legends. It is enriched by them. The wizard and the giant, the healer and the singer, the forgotten engineer and the dreaming pilgrim, all are present in its circle. To strip the stones of their myths would be to strip them of their life. Better to let the stories stand as the stones themselves stand, weathered but enduring, reminders that mystery is as much a part of history as fact. For hundreds of years, Stonehenge has embodied the tension between clarity and unanswered questions. Archaeologists have reconstructed timelines, mapped phases of construction, and proposed rituals to account for its purpose. They've described the monument as the creation of Neolithic farmers, ordinary people using ropes, sledges, and determination. And yet, when you stand among the stones, that explanation feels smaller than the monument itself. The official story may be neat, but it leaves much unsaid. The mainstream view is careful, cautious, and pragmatic. It tells us that beginning around 3,000 years before Christ, people dug ditches with antler picks, raised timber posts, then gradually moved on to stone. The bluestones came first, dragged from Wales or floated along rivers. Later, the Saracens were erected in their massive horseshoe capped with lintels. Over centuries, the monument was reshaped again and again, each stage reflecting shifts in ritual life. In this telling, Stonehenge is not a mystery, but a testament to patience, a project of generations determined to build something greater than themselves. And yet, that tidy account has its cracks. For one thing, it depends on feats of labour that strain belief. The bluestones, weighing up to 4 tons each, were transported over 150 miles. Even with modern equipment, such a task is daunting. The Saracens, some topping 40 tons, were raised with such precision that their lintels lock together using carpentry-style joints carved into stone. To call this the work of simple farmers feels like an understatement, one that risks erasing the true scale of what was accomplished. Small-scale experiments have been staged to show how the stones could have been moved. Volunteers with ropes and sledges have dragged heavy blocks short distances. Logs have been used as rollers, rafts floated down rivers. These demonstrations prove that the work was theoretically possible, but possibility is not the same as practicality. Moving one stone across a field is not the same as moving dozens across hills, valleys and waterways, coordinating the effort over decades. The scale remains staggering, even when reduced to diagrams of ramps and ropes. Then there are the alignments. Solstice sunrises and sunsets are obvious enough, but the potential tracking of lunar cycles and eclipses suggests something far more advanced. The 19-year lunar cycle, for instance, requires generations of observation to record. To encode it into architecture implies a long memory, preserved without writing, carried forward through ritual practice. How many lifetimes would it take for a pattern like that to be fully recognized, and how did such recognition survive without texts or tablets? This is where unease creeps in, because if we accept the mainstream story in full, we must also accept that people with no writing, no wheels, and only stone tools manage to organize projects of unprecedented scale, embed advanced astronomy in stone, and sustain the effort for centuries. That doesn't make them less impressive, it makes them more, and yet the official narrative often flattens them into early farmers, as if their sophistication must be minimized to fit our expectations of prehistory. Some anomalies are simply brushed aside. Bones found at Stonehenge and nearby sites show that people travelled from far corners of Britain, and perhaps even from continental Europe, to be part of the ceremonies. Pilgrimage on this scale implies a network of communication and meaning that stretched far beyond the local community. And yet in mainstream summaries this becomes ritual centre, a phrase that explains little and asks us not to press further. Ground surveys have revealed shafts and ditches surrounding the monument, some enormous, forming patterns that extend for miles. These discoveries suggest that Stonehenge was only one piece of a much larger ceremonial landscape, designed at a scale difficult to imagine without coordinated planning across generations. But again, the phrase ritual centre is invoked, as if repetition alone is enough to close the matter. To some, this cautious framing feels like avoidance, not an outright conspiracy, but a kind of intellectual tidying. Explanations are kept within the boundaries of what fits the accepted timeline of human development. Anything that suggests a more complex picture is trimmed or filed away, and so the monument remains both explained and unexplained, explained in terms of phases and tools, unexplained in terms of meaning and possibility. This tension feeds the idea that they, whether scholars, institutions, or simply the weight of orthodoxy, don't want us to know more. It's not always a matter of secrecy. Sometimes it's simply a reluctance to admit how much is still unknown. To say we don't know is to admit that history isn't neat, that our models are incomplete, that the past holds chapters we can't read. But to many people, that is the most exciting part. Mystery is not a weakness. It is a reminder of how vast human history really is. If we take the anomalies seriously, we start to glimpse a bigger picture. Stonehenge as more than a calendar, more than a burial site, more than a temple. Stonehenge as evidence that 5,000 years ago people had ways of thinking, organising and building that do not map neatly onto our categories. Knowledge can vanish, skills can be lost, traditions can be forgotten. The people of that age may have known things we no longer know, not machines or magic, but techniques, perceptions and beliefs that made their world richer and stranger than we allow ourselves to imagine. And perhaps that is the real thread running beneath both myth and archaeology, the sense that Stonehenge points to something missing in our story of ourselves, something we once understood, then forgot, something that still lingers in stone, silent but undeniable, waiting for us to notice that our explanations do not quite fit. If knowledge was lost, what form might it have taken? Some imagine forgotten tools, clever uses of timber, stone and water that left no trace behind. Others think of social structures, ways of mobilizing communities, inspiring devotion and transmitting memory across centuries. Still others point to a worldview itself as the missing element, to see the landscape as alive, the sky as sacred, the stones as infused with power. That perspective could unite people in ways we barely comprehend today. The phrase, "what they don't want you to know," often conjures visions of secrets locked away, of evidence hidden in dusty archives. Sometimes the truth is simpler. It may not be a matter of deliberate concealment, but of frameworks that cannot accommodate anomaly. The past is curated into neat categories: Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age. Within those categories, people are granted certain abilities and denied others. Farmers can build with wood, but not geometry. They can bury their dead, but not predict eclipses. They can feast, but not organize vast landscapes. Anything that does not fit is softened until it does. Yet the stones resist softening. They're too heavy, too precise, too enduring. They stand in defiance of easy explanations, daring us to admit that human history is not a straight road from ignorance to knowledge. It is a tangled path, where some wisdom is gained and some is lost, where skills rise and fade, where memory itself erodes. Stonehenge may be the remnant of such erosion, a surviving island of an ocean we can no longer see. This is why comparisons with other sites matter. Newgrange, Nabta Playa, the pyramids, Chaco Canyon, all show evidence of alignment with the heavens, all built by cultures long dismissed as primitive. If each developed their knowledge independently, it suggests a universal human impulse to bind life to the cosmos. If knowledge travelled between them, it implies networks and exchanges we scarcely imagine. Either way, the result is the same. Ancient people were more capable, more observant, more sophisticated than the official story often admits. And yet, anomalies are rarely foregrounded. Excavations sometimes yield findings that remain unpublished for decades. Hypotheses that stray too far from orthodoxy are quietly shelved. The image of Stonehenge as a ritual centre is maintained because it is safe, because it leaves the mystery intact without forcing uncomfortable revisions. To the curious mind, this feels less like explanation and more like containment, as if the role of authority is not to reveal, but to manage how much uncertainty the public is allowed to see. But uncertainty is not weakness. It is the true strength of Stonehenge. For in its silence, the monument preserves possibilities. It resists being pinned down, reminding us that not everything in history can be made neat. Perhaps what they don't want us to know is not a secret fact, but a secret condition, that the past is stranger than we allow, that we are not its masters, that our frameworks are provisional and fragile. If that sounds unsettling, it should, because the stones are unsettling. They tell us that thousands of years ago, people built with precision and purpose that outstrips our categories. They aligned their lives with the sky, buried their dead in sacred earth, gathered from across the land, and raised giants of stone that still command the horizon. They were not our inferiors. In many ways, they may have been our equals, or even our betters in ways we can no longer measure. So when we ask what Stonehenge really was, we should be careful not to accept small answers. It was not just a calendar, not just a graveyard, not just a temple. It was all of these and more, a nexus where life, death, sky, and earth converged. A monument of meaning, layered across centuries, encoded in ways we have only begun to notice. Its true story may never be fully recovered, but that does not make it less real. It makes it more profound. And that brings us back to the question of concealment. What is hidden here? Perhaps nothing more than our own reluctance to admit that mystery remains. Perhaps what they don't want you to know is that the past is not finished, not settled, not as simple as the timelines in textbooks. To leave Stonehenge as ritual centre is to close the book too soon. To acknowledge its mystery is to leave the book open, to allow ourselves to keep reading, even if the pages are blank. Stonehenge still stands, its silence unbroken, its meaning unresolved. It stands not as a ruin, but as a riddle carved in stone, a reminder that human history is deeper, stranger, and more wondrous than we often allow. And maybe that is the secret worth guarding. Not that there is one hidden truth, but that the truth itself is vast, irreducible, and alive. As the sun rises over the Heelstone and sets into the trilithons, as shadows lengthen across the plain, the stones continue their patient watch. They do not reveal, they do not explain, they endure, and in their endurance they challenge us to wonder, not only about who built them, or how, or why, but about what it means that we still do not know. Thank you for watching.